Synthesizers are one of the most common instruments used in music today. But when did synthesizer first get its pop music debut? When was the first pop song to use a synth? Previously, I thought that Abbey Road, released in 1969, must have been one of the first examples of synth in a rock band setting. Abbey Road features 4 different songs using the synth.
Teacher gets annoyed.
Little darling, the smile's returning to the face. Sun, 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 here it comes. Sun, sun, sun.
Before I started researching for this video, I had naively assumed that the Beatles in 1969 was one of the first examples of synth in rock or pop music. And although it was one of the earlier examples, there was plenty more releases before 1969 that featured the synthesizer in a rock or pop setting. So today I'm going to work back through some of those and show you the artists that beat the Beatles to the punch and brought the synth into the world of pop and rock music. Even just 1 year earlier, in 1968, Simon and Garfunkel of all acts actually used the Moog on their track Save the Life of My Child. In fact, Robert Moog, the inventor of the Moog synthesizer, actually helped set up the synth for this recording session. So that's 1968, but we can go earlier than that. 1967 was a big year for the synth, as it was the first year that the Moog was commercially available. 67, for example, saw Jim Morrison using the Moog, albeit subtly, on the title track to Strange Days by The Doors. The Monkees also used the Moog synthesizer, featuring it on a couple tracks from their album Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn and Jones Limited. The Byrds also used the Moog synthesizer on their album The Notorious Byrd Brothers, released January 1968. A key figure in popularising the Moog synthesizer that I need to mention is Paul Beaver. Paul Beaver was the US West Coast sales representative for Moog and introduced the instrument to the Monkees, the Byrds and George Harrison. But Paul Beaver was a lot more than just a sales representative. He also performed on, or assisted on, a lot of the synth recordings that I've mentioned so far. In fact, when he was demoing to George Harrison what the Moog could do, George Harrison actually secretly recorded him and then used what he had played as the basis of his experimental electronic sound album. Beaver also contributed to a lesser-known synth rock album called The Zodiac Cosmic Sounds, which was the first rock album released to feature the Moog, released May 1967. So that's the earliest example of the Moog synthesizer in rock or pop music. But what about other types of synthesizer? In 1966, an album was released that featured a synthesizer known as the electro-theremin. The album was, of course, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. The track I Just Wasn't Made for These Times features the electro-theremin in the instrumental bridge, although you'd be forgiven for mistaking the sound for a Beach Boy singing really high. But of course, the most significant use of the electro-theremin has to be good vibrations.
She's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
Unlike with the previous albums we've looked at, which had used the brand new Moog synthesizer, the theremin had actually been around since at least the 1920s. It was Brian Wilson's idea to bring the sound of the theremin into pop music.
I thought to myself, I'm picking up good vibrations, and I thought, the cello was going, and I said, as long as we're doing something eerie today, why not get real eerie and put a theremin on it, you know? At the high, it needs to sound like, ah. The idea that when you take classical instruments and place them in a rock and roll environment, you have refined music. You have rock and roll brought to a height.
So the Beach Boys were using synth in 1966, but can we go earlier than that? Telstar by the Tornadoes, released in 1962, was a hit instrumental that featured a synth called the clavioline. Telstar doesn't just feature synth in the background, it's the main melody, and this song got to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. And whilst we're talking about the Tornadoes, a little bit of trivia that I need to mention is that the guitarist from the Tornadoes, George Bellamy, is the dad of Matt Bellamy, the frontman from Muse. And Telstar was actually a big influence on Muse's Knights of Sidonia. The synthesizer being used on Telstar, the clavioline, was actually used by the Beatles in 1967 as well, on the track Baby You're a Rich Man. So the Tornadoes were using the clavioline in 1962, but in 1961, another hit record came out featuring the clavioline, Runaway by Del Shannon.
My little runaway. Run, 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 run away.
Max Crook, who performed and wrote the synth line on Runaway, performed it on a synth that he dubbed the Musitron. The Musitron was a heavily modified clavioline that Crook had built himself.
It's called a Musitron, and it's something that I made out of parts and pieces of another instrument, probably 3 other instruments actually, and some other electronic parts.
So Runaway, released in 1961, that's surely got to be the earliest example of a synth on a pop record, right? Well, it turns out that we were actually looking in the wrong decade. In 1953, an artist called Frank Shaxfield released a track called Little Red Monkey that also features the clavioline. Little Red Monkey got into the top 10 in the UK, making it potentially the earliest pop hit to feature a synth. So there's me thinking that the Beatles were pioneering synth music in 1969, when 16 years earlier we'd had synth music in the charts. So Little Red Monkey in 1953, that's the earliest example that I could find. But when I uploaded this video the first time round, I actually got quite a lot of comments pointing out an earlier synth instrument called the Nova chord. The Nova chord was created by Hammond, the same Hammond that made the legendary Hammond organ. The Nova chord is one of the earliest examples of a polyphonic synthesizer, meaning that it can play more than one note at a time, which is something that the Moog couldn't even do in 1967. And when I say early, I mean early. The Nova chord can actually be heard on Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again, which was released way back in 1939, so we really were looking in the wrong decade before.
Again, don't know where, don't know where.
When I uploaded this video the first time, quite a lot of people were asking me how I define a synthesizer. They were asking whether I consider a Hammond organ to be a synthesizer, for example. And the problem is there isn't really an official definition of what a synthesizer is. There's no real consensus about what truly defines a synthesizer. The definition that I used in this video is that a synthesizer is an instrument that creates its sound purely using one or more electronic oscillators. So no physical mechanisms can create the sound, and it also can't be a playback of an existing sample, like on a mellotron where it's using a tape loop to create its sound. But anyway, 1939 might be a bit hard to beat, but if you can think of any other earlier examples of synth, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. And a massive thank you, as always, goes to my supporters on Patreon, including the names you see on screen now and the extra amazing people that you see on this list. Andre Sainz Diaja, Andrew Brown, Andy Deacon, Austin Barrett, Bob McKinstry, Chris Cabell, Christopher Ryan, Daniel Long, Daryl, Darren Harvey, Esben Hansen, FD Hodor, George Taylor, Golf House, James Ko, J.A. Kockensparger, Joe Vasson, Jonas Soderstrom, Justin Vigor, Melody Composers Squared, Nancy Gillard, Nicholas, Orlando Bernard, Paul Pazel, Peter Dunphy, Roger Clay, T. Newport, and Tim Beaker.
I had no idea that it would be a hit record. We had thought we weren't even going to release it because it was so bizarre. It was such a
cello and a theremin.
Yeah, it was a bizarre record. Our company, our record company said, Capitol Records goes, that's too long. They said it's too long. It was 3:35. You know, the time on it was 3 minutes and 35 seconds. 3 minutes and 35 seconds. And the company said, our Capitol Records said, we were going to go with Help Me Rhonda. No, wait, what was the record that you, with Barbara Ann or something like that? They wanted to release Barbara Ann. And we said, no, let me logically convince you that this record, we didn't think, and then after we had gotten people over to the, over to our houses listening, people were flipping, they're going, whew, that's a great fucking record, man. And I said, but our company doesn't want to release it. And they said, well, you shouldn't listen to your company, force them to put it out, you know? And that goddamn record went out and went to #1 in the nation, in the whole nation. And all because of that theremin and the cello.